8 minutes and 46 seconds. That was when we saw a horrific event. That's how long it was, and nothing happened. George Floyd was murdered in cold blood, and there's only one thing that we can do about it now, and it's reform. Change the world. I live in Minnesota, which is makes this interesting to say, because I always thought that Minnesota was the better place, the one that was different than the rest of the country. I saw through, or I looked past the previous events in Minneapolis and St. Paul and those kind of, in that area, of violence that had occurred towards African American people by the police. And I was like, well, that's just an anomaly. But it's not an anomaly. It's a systemic thing that's going on in Minnesota. The African American minority is one of the smallest in the country, I think. Like, there isn't a large population. And yet, this happens, these events have happened multiple times in the past 5 or 6 years in Minnesota history. And rightfully, there are now protests for reform, and hopefully they succeed. Governor Walz, the governor of Minnesota, has promised that he is going to go for reform. He's going to do everything he can, and I hope that that's the truth. But now these protests have erupted all across the country. It's not just in Minnesota. This is a nationwide problem at this point. Nationwide event. Problem is the wrong term. If reform comes, and I very much hope it does, it will be the best possibility. Now, I'm calling on my, the atheist community as well as the LGBTQ plus community to join these protests to fight for what is right. To get a goal of successfully changing police reform. Because if this can happen to the African American people in the United States, they could do this to anyone, at least any minority. If the wrong person got into power, like let's say the NIFB, no one would bat an eye if they started doing this to gay people. At least no one would bat an eye more than what is happening now. If an authoritarian Christian, someone who wants immense power and wanted to remove atheism, this could just as easily happen to them, to us. But if we change the way policing is done now and do what we can to alleviate this from happening again, in all hopes, not only will this never happen to African Americans, it will never happen to anyone ever again. Because I've seen the pictures from the 70s and the 80s of the Pride movement and what happened then to protesters and stuff. And it looks very similar to what is happening now. And if we can't stand up and fight for other people's rights, we shouldn't stand up and fight for our own. This is a hard video to make because generally I'm not quite as serious. I like to talk about more entertaining topics like Paul and Morgan, or I don't know if entertaining is the right word. Topics that are much more in the grand scheme unimportant and have less involvement, but I find them entertaining and they're very much within my comfort zone of what I like to talk about because I'm more knowledgeable on that. I understand those things more. This cannot stand. The peaceful protests that are going on, because I personally am not against the rioting, because I know people who live in the areas that are being dealt with the rioting, at least in Minneapolis and St. Cloud when this was going on. And it's horrible. I have a cousin in the National Guard. He's down, or I think he was relieved recently, so he's no longer down in Minneapolis. Or like a gas station I used to go to when I lived down in that region by the University of St. Thomas. That gas station was burned down. Like, these are places I've been to, people who are being afflicted or people I know and care about, both in the riots and to the people who are being attacked in protest. So I call on us to join the protest, to fight for life and dignity, which is a weird thing to say, because it's a lot of what religious right people will say about abortion, which I'm just bringing that up. But if we can fight for human dignity, hopefully this kind of event won't happen again to anyone. So I hope you found this video important. I'm going to try to get it to 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but have an amazing day. Go do something in your local city, in your area. Call for justice for George Floyd.